Young Count David Pons stood on the hill above the capital city of Rush, trembling with rage. In one hand, he held a copy of the French Bible, in the other, a bottle of hard liquor. "Christians," he muttered hatefully through clenched teeth. "How wonderful the world would be without them." For a moment, he stared into the distance, where the French coastline was visible on the horizon. They knew how to deal with them there. More than 80 years had passed since the infamous St. Bartholomew's Night, and in France the Edict of Nantes had long been in force, guaranteeing Protestants almost the same rights as Catholics since 1598. Still, David thought a little St. Bartholomew's Night would do this island good. La Pays des Cygnes was an independent kingdom with a population of over 200,000. When the Huguenot Wars began in France, many French Christians fled here, to this sparsely populated island nation. On the other side of Mount Tranchon, an entirely new town had sprung up, populated mostly by these refugees. It was no wonder, the island was French-speaking, and the kings of this small realm had welcomed the newcomers. The population continued to grow. Protestants were persecuted across Europe way too often. Waldensians also found their way here, for since 1560 they could no longer be sure of their safety in Savoy. At that time, they had lost some of their alpine valleys and privileges, and harder times had begun for them. And if there was anyone who could make David furious, it was the Waldensians. In truth, he knew very little about them, but they were far more zealous and convincing in their faith than others. In the capital, they had a beautiful new church, where for several years now a fiery old preacher had been delivering sermons, his jokes entertaining the whole city. And the worst thing was that Princess Annabel, to whom David was betrothed, liked the Waldensians' teaching. David took an angry swig from his bottle. It was late afternoon, and he was already quite drunk, though still able to stand and read. He opened the Bible at random. It was the first chapter of the prophet Ezekiel. He shook his head in anger, took another swig, and began to read aloud. "And the living creatures ran back and forth, in appearance like a flash of lightning. Now as I looked at the living creatures, behold, a wheel was on the earth beside each living creature with its 4 faces." "Wheels with eyes? Seriously?" he shouted angrily toward the sky. "And I'm supposed to read this nonsense? I'm supposed to lose this land because of this? I'm going to be king here. Do you hear me, God?" It was too much for him. Down at the castle, the celebration of the princess's 16th birthday was just beginning. David was a year older than she was, and they had been engaged for several years. Annabel was an only child, and her husband was meant to be the future king of the land. For years, David had been certain that this husband would be him. "If you don't humble yourself before God, I'll have to break our engagement," he angrily muttered the lines from her letter, which he knew by heart. "God will give you a new heart and a new life. A fountain of wisdom I've found in the Bible. And shouldn't it rather be a fountain of stupidity?" he suddenly yelled, taking another swig. "What will it be next, after those wheels with eyes? Flying plates? Or maybe even a talking toilet?" As he walked, he opened the Bible again. This time his eyes fell on the genealogy of Jesus Christ. "Is this really your word, God?" he called toward the heavens, sipping again. "Do you want to bore us to death with this? Can't you write anything better? Maybe you should hire a more talented author, since clearly you're not cut out for writing books." By the time he reached the castle, he was truly drunk. The celebration was in the grand ballroom on the ground floor, and he staggered among the guests, scanning for Annabel. He spotted her among a group of friends, staring at him in disbelief. After a moment, she recovered and came toward him. "What are you doing here, David?" she asked quietly but sharply. "I told you not to come tonight." "I came to toast you, sweetheart," he bellowed drunkenly. "And besides, You said I shouldn't show my face until I at least opened the Bible, if I remember right. Well, I did, and it's nothing but nonsense, just so you know. Steering wheels and talking toilets, rambled David, who now could no longer tell what he had actually read and what he'd made up. Go home, David, Annabelle hissed. You're clearly drunk. Less than the one who wrote this, he said, pointing to the book in his hand. You're a fool if you believe this. It's fit only for a chicken brain like girls have. Any man can see at first glance it's rubbish. Get yourself a henhouse, dear, you'll love it. You can cluck about this nonsense with the other hens. You know what you'll be? Queen of the chickens, the first. Don't be an idiot, David, said Laurent, one of his friends. For insulting the royal family, you could be publicly whipped at the pillory. Get out of here and talk to her when you're sober. Someone please fetch the guards, Annabelle said to the young men standing nearby. Oh, come on, Bella, are you really so stupid as to turn your back on your fiancé because of a pile of such drivel? It doesn't make any sense. Only some headless knight could believe it. He doesn't have a brain either, you know. A headless knight and a silly girl like you. Get out, David, Laurent said again, pushing him toward the window. The guards are coming. Laurent shoved him along, and David kept shouting something about hereditary Protestant stupidity plaguing the entire royal family. He half climbed, half fell out the window. In the process, the Bible slipped from his grip. Laurent picked it up, shaking his head in disbelief. David drained the last drops from his bottle and staggered toward the river. Eventually he reached the Waldensian Church. He glared at the building with hatred. For a moment, he imagined it engulfed in flames. Then he shook his head to banish the thought. At that moment, two men came out of the church. They locked the door and lingered outside, talking. The older man leaned on a cane and began explaining something to the younger, who looked troubled and shook his head. Then the older man opened a Bible and read aloud to him. The younger listened intently, nodding, and finally, the old man tucked the Bible under his arm, placed a hand on the young man's shoulder, and began to pray for him. They shook hands, and the young man hurried away. David stood like a statue, watching them angrily. The whole scene infuriated him. He knew at once that the old man was the Waldensian preacher whom Annabelle had often spoken about, and he felt a wave of hatred rising within him. He couldn't move. The old man noticed him, smiled faintly, and walked toward him. David raised the bottle to his lips to avoid meeting his gaze, but it was already empty. You look troubled, young man, the old preacher said, stopping a few paces away and studying him. Would you like to talk? I wish you'd all just get out of here, David muttered through his teeth. Every last mangy Christian. What have we done to you? The old man asked gently. If I were king of this land, David spat, I'd have you all shot. Not a single preacher with some stupid book would be left. I'd give you another St. Bartholomew's night. Well, you're not the king of this land, and you probably never will be, the preacher replied mildly, but that only enraged David further. Because of you, he bellowed. I was supposed to be king of this land. What did you say to her? For God's sake, what did you tell her that made her not want me now? David strode up to the old man and grabbed him by the coat. The preacher's cane fell from his hand, and he staggered slightly. He now understood who he was speaking to. You can't even imagine how much I hate you, David hissed into his face. Let us speak calmly for a moment, Count Pawn, the preacher suggested gently. No one wants to deprive you of the throne or of the princess. There is another way to resolve all this. David looked at him through narrowed eyes. The old man slightly lifted the Bible in his hand. What if I read you a beautiful story about a man who also hated the church, and then met God in a miraculous way? The only way you might make some impression on the princess is by trying to understand her. All these things mean a great deal to her. I don't want to try to understand that nonsense about wheels with eyes, David snapped. 6 months ago, she was a normal girl who was fun to be with. Now she prays, reads the Bible, and goes to church all the time. I can't stand it. And the worst part is she thinks I should do it too. I don't understand why she can't just keep it to herself. You bear the name of a great king, David, and you can become such a man yourself too. The preacher tried again, speaking mildly, weighing carefully how much one could discuss such matters with a man who was drunk. He had heard the way David slurred some words, and noticed the unsteadiness of his gait. Just, please, try to understand. Those who believe in Jesus cannot help but speak of it. We have experienced something extraordinary, an encounter with the living God. Annabelle will hardly marry you unless you go through the same. The Bible says it is entirely unsuitable for a believer to marry an unbeliever, you know. David stared at him, mouth agape. That's from that stupid book? That she shouldn't marry me? The preacher only shrugged. It's not over yet, David. Let's talk a little about how you could become the man who impresses her, instead of finding fault in her or even in the Bible. I should change? David shouted angrily. Why me? She's the fool, and that book is rubbish. I won't change. I'll smash her faith into 1,000 pieces. And what if you first learned something about it? The preacher suggested. You can take this Bible if you like. The old man went on speaking for a while, but David's mind suddenly went black. He stared at the book in his hand. He hated it with a passion, and now someone was pushing it on him again. For the 3rd or 4th time in recent days. He wanted to take another swig from his bottle, but as he raised it, he remembered it was empty. The preacher, unable to see through the dark glass, stepped toward him. What if you give me that bottle and take this instead? He offered, holding out the Bible again. To David, it felt like a bad joke. He gripped the bottle more tightly, and in some kind of drunken blackout, he suddenly swung it with all his strength. For an instant, he felt like a mere spectator to what was happening, as if some inner force, hidden within him and completely disconnected from his mind, had acted. Somewhere in the haze of his drunken head, a quiet voice was screaming for him to stop, but it was already too late. The glass bottle shattered against the preacher's head. The old man tried to raise his Bible in defense, but David's attack was sudden and swift. For a moment, it seemed to David as though time had stopped. He watched the old man's body fall very slowly to the ground. Blood was pouring from his head. His arms flopped outward like a rag doll. The Bible fell into the dust beside him, and the old man landed with a dull thud on the dirt, where he lay motionless. David stared at him, eyes wide, until a terrified cry rang out from the distance. 2 women were approaching. They had seen everything, and now they screamed as if being stabbed. For some strange reason, David bent down and picked up the preacher's Bible. Then he stumbled into a run. He had to get away. It felt as though he had sobered up in an instant. His thoughts were suddenly clear, yet his body, still dulled by alcohol, would not obey him fully. He fled like a madman out into the forest's surrounding rush. He ran like a hunted animal, his mind flashing from one image to another. Vividly, he recalled the dead old man with the broken head, and just as clearly, he now remembered the execution of a murderer he had witnessed the previous year. He could see the man's terrified face, the noose around his neck, and the executioner pulling the lever of the trapdoor. He remembered the judge's impassive face and his friend's half-curious, half-frightened looks and comments. But in his imagination now, the condemned murderer's face had become his own,